welcome everyone. This is the ABPMP webinar that is being presented by Laura Graham, dealing with BPMN. I'm Rod Moyer. I've been doing process improvement things for about 25 years out of the Philadelphia area. This is the first of a two-part series. Today we're going to start with the basics and build a foundation for a more advanced look. That advanced look will be in October. There will be a webinar in September with Dr. Matthias Kirschner, but the second half of this will occur in October. Before we get started, there's a couple of housekeeping points. First, if you experience any technical difficulties, the first thing you should do is try leaving and coming back in. If that doesn't work, send us a note and we'll see if we can help you. If you have questions as Laura is presenting, go ahead and post them, and she'll attempt to answer them, or at least some of them, during the presentation. There will also be questions that are answered at the end of the session. So there'll be a group of those then that you can put up. This webinar, as all the webinars, will be posted on the website within a couple of days. I also have an announcement here. We have sent out an email addressing the start of the association's HINTS program, HINTS being things that you wish you knew before you had to deal with a problem, things that you learned, advice that you would give to a fellow practitioner, somebody new in the field, that sort of thing. We're collecting the hints through the website, so help us and send in any hints that you have. And this activity will actually, once we collect things, intend to in late October begin to post hints that could be helpful to other people. Now that the announcements have been made, I'd like to introduce Laura Graham. Laura's Vice President of Enterprise Products at Northern Trust Bank, and she's been a BPM practitioner for over 10 years. She is experienced in both the business and IT sides of BPM. In her career, she served as a process analyst and enterprise process architect and the leader of the BPM Center of Excellence. She has taught over 500 business process analysts how to model in BPMN. She has presented for ABPMP as well as for PECS. Laura holds a black belt in Six Sigma and is also a business process architect, and she also happens to be past president of the Chicago chapter of ABPMP. And it's now my pleasure to turn the book content over to Laura.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Rod. I really appreciate it, and welcome all my fellow ABPMP attendees. As Rod mentioned, this is the first of a two-part session. I'm going to do my best to cram 2 days worth of normal training material into two-hour sections. We'll get through what we can today, and as Rod mentioned, we'll continue along in October as well. So if you do have questions, please post them as we go along. Some may be more applicable to a slide that I'm on. I'll try to talk through them, and then we will have some time for Q&A at the end, and I'll be able to stay on for a few extra minutes. I do intend to build on what Bruce Silver had previously presented. I've had the opportunity to be taught and trained initially by Bruce Silver myself. He was one of the key influencers in exposing me to BPM method and style. Since then, I've had the opportunity to put it in practice both from a business analyst perspective as well as in the IT system utilizing BPM systems, currently in the IBM Lombardi space. So I'll talk a little bit about it from a business analyst perspective as well as modeling from an execution perspective. I do want to go ahead and get started. A little bit of grounding, I think, kind of touching on building off of where Bruce had presented with you all a couple months ago. And as fellow ABPMers, I'm kind of hoping that you're all in agreement with some of this, and we can go through these slides quickly before diving into the meat of the presentation. So So process mapping. Why do we want a process map, types of process maps, why the standard notation, and how to approach process mapping? Why process map? There's certainly the internal benefits of the organization, facilitates training of new employees. It helps to prioritize and align process improvement initiatives. I think the broader the process model, the bigger the process you go, the more it helps to align and prioritize when it comes time to capital planning. And in terms of scoping your projects, especially when you're getting into IT development, capital appropriation, you can't tackle everything all at once. So where do you want to start? We've all experienced, working in individual silos and trying to fight each other for a limited bucket of money. I think when you process model from a larger picture, it can help align people and get people on board with where the biggest pain points are when they visually see it. Okay. There's certainly external requirements. Just a couple of ISO and SOX statements up there. Everything going on with the SEC, Dodd-Frank, SOX. I think that's really key to understand is management understands the process, including the IT handoff, well enough to understand the point at which a misstatement could arise. So that's going to impact pretty much everyone, not just those in the financial industry, but manufacturing, the healthcare, insurance, all of that really kind of comes into play. So I don't know how many managers really understand the process, the manual aspects, as well as the IT handoff to enough detail that say they could sign off on that. So I think I've lost presentation. Larry, I have lost presentation. It says share my screen. Thank you. So the big thing with a process from my perspective is a lot of times, you'll be talking, especially in an area that, maybe sales or maybe a more strategic area that doesn't understand the point of process as much as an operational or a manufacturing environment is. And they'll say, oh, we really don't have a process, or it's not a very good one, or it's not standardized. And I would say, well, just because it's not standardized or it isn't formalized doesn't mean one doesn't exist. And if you don't understand it or it's not clear, there are usually a lot of unintended consequences for that. And that could be internal, it could be external, and have legal ramifications as well. One of my favorite quotes is from Henry Ford. He said, if I solicited business requirements from people and I had asked what they wanted, they would have said they wanted a faster horse. And I think that part of the problem is he used the term what people wanted, not what people wanted to do. Big part about process is it's all about the verbs. It's the activity of transferring inputs into another output. And if you focus on the tool that you're using, you, I think, just generally narrow the perspective of what people are expecting or can articulate. If you focus on the actions of what people want to do, if you had said, what is it that you want to do? And they said, well, I want to get someplace from here to there faster, that frees them up. And he could have invented the automobile that way rather than if he had asked them what they need. The other key thing is not just focusing on a limited set of actions of I want to go faster from here to there. We could have built a Stargate, or we could have built railroads. The key thing with the automobile is I want to go from here to there, where there changes on an arbitrary basis. Any time of the day, I want to go to the grocery store, and sometimes I want to go to work, and sometimes I want to go to a friend's house. If Henry had bothered to sit down and ask people extensively of what they want to do, he probably would have come up with some pretty good requirements. The key thing when soliciting business requirements and building a process map is focusing on the verbs. And I think that's one of the greater challenges that we have. And part of the problem that I see with a lot of process models today is they're really not process models. I'll see systems interaction diagrams or use cases. And if we want to really focus on improving the process, if we can get a good understanding of the verbs and the what, why behind them, the better the process map and the freer we can be with our innovation and the improvements that we go about building. Okay, so I think that, again, ABPMP practitioners, this is from our common body of knowledge, different types of process maps and what goes on them. Key thing is activities. Decisions, generally we refer to as gateways. We'll talk about those extensively in the BPM space. Dependencies in terms of sequence, what has to happen before something else can happen. There's a big difference between what can be in sequence versus in parallel. There's definitely a relationship to data in terms of both determining your decisions and dependencies. Milestones is a key thing from a business user's perspective, kind of an end result or an intermittent milestone. Errors, exception paths, people put performers, you can use swim lanes to represent that. Systems and tools are sometimes represented on a process map. Again, I might argue that those are more applicable to a systems interaction diagram, but we will talk about them in the context of BPMN and how to represent them. Inputs and outputs are always good to represent in terms of what goes into a process must come out. If something's going into a process and nothing's coming out, then you got to question whether it's really a value-add activity. And if something's coming out of a process but nothing's going into it, you're not looking broad enough. So I like to represent my inputs and outputs on a process map, and we'll see how to do that. And then process metrics. We see that more from, again, a business analyst side. But as we start talking about implementing a process in an executional environment, I think that's the big advantage of knowing BPMN is you have a process that's understood by the business. It's also being executed in a real-time IT environment and being able to overlay the metrics on the process map so that it makes sense to a process owner and being able to identify metrics or where the exceptions are being routed to more commonly, and that's where they need to focus their improvement efforts on. I think that's the real power of using BPMS comes in, and one of the core reasons for why we want to use BPMN. Okay, so I'm not going to belabor this. I know Bruce Silver probably covered it extensively, but why do you want to have a standard notation is really, it's up to the person who's drawing the model, who makes decisions of what goes onto it. But just because it makes sense to you doesn't mean it's going to make sense to everybody else. Another key thing is all models are wrong, just some of them are useful. And we need to make sure that our models are useful, otherwise we're just promoting non-value-add activity in terms of creating them in the first place. So why a standard approach? Again, BPMN, one of the powerful benefits is being able to communicate between business and IT can sometimes feel like you're talking 2 or 3 different languages, even if you're just all trying to communicate in English in terms of specifying your requirements. So it's another reason. So here's a case of illustrating why the standard notation. And I think back to, I want to say, maybe 15 years ago when I thought that, as an industrial engineer, as a Six Sigma black belt, that I knew what a process model was, and I thought very process-oriented. I'd go into PowerPoint or Visio and draw a process model, and I'd think, again, just because I knew what I meant, what other users would think. So, it was pretty clear for me of when things were happening in sequence, like in the lower left here in the red, sequence is pretty clear of the order of the activities. But when you start talking about things that are happening in parallel, it can be a lot more confusing. So I could have meant that all 3 of the activities here in blue on the left, all of them needed to happen before we started to do different work. But someone in the IT space might have thought, well, okay, as soon as I do the first box of doing work, when I'm done with that, I need to go on and do different work. So it's a question of, is this an and or is this an or condition? When do we do different work? What's really triggering it? And BPMN as a notation gives you a very powerful, yet simple and easy to understand symbol to be able to clarify the difference. So now in the upper right, we see all 3 of the activities need to happen. And we're going to stop and wait for all 3 of them to happen before we go ahead and do different work. versus in the bottom right where it's an or condition and any of the three activities on the left can happen before we go on and do different work. To advanced slides doesn't work. Thanks. All right. So again, pulling from the ABPMP common body of knowledge, there are a lot of different notations that are out there. BPMN, again, I think to be the most easy to understand from a business user's perspective. There are a lot of what I consider more technical, like the IDF and the UML standards that are out there that are more geared towards the IT side and less familiar to the business side. And then there can be, flow charting or the Rumler-Brock methodology that's more business oriented and doesn't have enough of the science that's needed to specify the and or conditions that are needed from an IT side of the house. So one of the questions when it comes to process modeling is, how do we get everything that we need on a single sheet of paper? And the answer is start with the happy path. We'll worry about the exceptions and the errors at a later point in time. And I don't think that that's a bad approach. Certainly starting with the happy path may be what is desired to happen, but what is desired to happen versus what actually happens in real life is often overlooking the aspects that you can improve upon the most often. So the happy path is usually not where we need to focus our improvements. It's how to remove and reduce the errors and exceptions that are happening. So I would really discourage you from trying to focus only on the happy path and not getting your users to talk about the 80-20. The other thing that I'd like to mention is when you're talking about a process, users can answer what they do as it relates to handling an order or building an order or shipping an order. But one of the other key questions is what else do you do in a given week and what's causing those tasks to be done? And usually what you'll uncover from that is all of the manual activity that they have to do in support of gathering process metrics for the errors and exceptions that do happen. And even though the metrics is not directly related to the processing itself, it does drive some of the key requirements that you need to specify when you're trying to improve the process. So it's one of the key questions that I like to ask. So this slide I put together to represent the concept of the 80-20 misnomer. Usually when you're soliciting insight from users, they're going to say, well, that doesn't happen all that much of the time. Let's focus on the 80-20 and not worry about it. But in any given process, you're going to have multiple user groups. And if you only focus on the 80-20 for any given task, you're going to end up with, again, missing the big boat. So the 80-20 is not what happens during any particular task. It's you want to get to 80% of all of your process instances to end up at the happy path. So walking through this particular model, if you start in the upper left by the green circle, after your first task completes, if you have 80% going across the top and 20% is an exception path going down, you get to task 2 on the upper swim lane, and after that completes, if you have another 80% and 20% split, by the time you get to the end happy path, it's not 80-20, it's 80 times 80, or 64% of your total results are meeting your end happy path. And that's with only 2 gateways or 2 decision points. And I can guarantee you that pretty much any business process that you're going to model is going to have a lot more of those. So you want to make sure that you do focus on the exception paths and some of those other 20 percentiles so that you can see that, really across the top swim lane, there's no issue. I don't need to address it. I do want to be looking at where I'm getting the 16% and the 16% in the middle case, and maybe if I can reduce those tasks, I can really get to the true 80% happy path, and 20% is the alternative end on the bottom. Okay, a lot of times that I teach BPMN, I get a lot of questions from the BAs out there of help me translate English into a process model, and what do these symbols mean? And when I'm talking with a business user who doesn't know BPMN, they're not going to know sequence, and they're not going to know exclusive gateways and different types of events. So I'm going to try to talk through that as I go through the BPMN notation with you. Again, activities really focus on the strong verbs. Inputs and outputs are the direct objects of a sentence. I think from a process perspective, it's a lot similar to grammar. I'm always looking for the verbs and the direct objects. Business rules do come into play, especially when we start talking about gateways and decisions. Your conjunctions, your and, your or, the if-then statements are your dependencies, but you need to be careful. From an English perspective, we don't think a lot about this when we talk, but the word and has no sense of whether it's in sequence or in parallel with each other. When you use the words and then, that is implying that first something happens and then something else, that it's a natural sequence. If you don't use the word then, and they just use the word, first I do A and I do B, you're like, well, do you have to do A first and then do B, or can you do B and then do A, or does it really matter? So be careful of that from an English perspective. I love the if, the else, the sometimes, the it depends, well, not always, or I don't really know. That's where I think you got to put your BA hat on. A lot of times when you're talking to the business, they'll talk in codes. They'll start using systems, and legacy applications that were built in the 1960s really restricted the amount of data that we could enter, so they'll use codes and numbers. I often try to decipher, is that a business rule? Is that a system constraint? Is it a system? What's really going on there? And try to separate out I don't really care if you're updating system XYZ. Why are you updating system XYZ? What are you really trying to do there? Are you trying to store things for your financial report statements? Are you trying to store things for client data and maintenance? Really getting under why are you going to this system? The other big question is, to what level of detail do you go? And there's no right answer. I would say it depends a lot on what your business goals and objectives are, and I hate giving that answer, it depends. As we go through BPMN, we're going to talk a lot about, again, the science and the art, or the methodology and the style behind it, and there are different ways of process modeling. I'd go so far as to say, in my opinion, the more detailed, the better, but you don't have time to spend 6 years of process modeling in an organization. You'll never maintain a job doing that way. So it's really a delicate balance. I think the big thing is trying to align your process model to the scope of the initiative. So if the business is coming to you and they know right away that they want to implement a workflow, or they want to get out of rekeying data and want systems integration, anytime you start talking about systems integration, you're going to have to go pretty deep, and you need to prepare the business for that up front. The better job you do up front, the more successful you'll be with making that system integration occur. If they're talking about just trying to prioritize what their goals and objectives are for next year, and trying to get a feel for, do we want to spend 6 years process modeling or not, then you can stay at a higher level. There's no right answer, but I'd say for any particular process, any particular page on that process, you should expect to have between 8 and 50 elements on that. And some of that comes from, again, the psychological of, if you have less than 8 activities on your process map, either one, you're probably too siloed to really be trying to improve anything, or you're too high level and it's not really a process model, it's more of a SciPoc or a PowerPoint type way of communicating things, and you're really not talking about trying to understand things accurately enough to improve it. When you start getting around 50 elements on a diagram, that's probably a key that you're getting a little bit too broad, and you're trying to conquer the world, if you will. So again, when we're talking about the level of detail, if you look at this example, I think there's about 35 boxes on here. What I find when I'm process modeling is if I can get it all on one page, this can look like a really complex process. But once it's all documented, I can understand the accuracies of it. Then I can start to try to clean it up a little bit. And if you're looking at this slide here, I think that there's probably a few of you that are making some natural groupings in your mind's eye. So if there are a couple of you who are still paying attention, in the Q&A session, if you could type in how many high-level groups of activities you think you see on this slide, go ahead and do so now. Larry, I don't know if you're seeing any responses or if I put everyone to sleep already. Okay, I'm not able to see them, so Larry, if you can jump in and let me know what people are answering.
I'm getting the low is 3. The high that I see so far is, let me scroll down, I see a 7. Perfect.
Okay, so that's generally what I'd get from answers. And for those of you who see 3, you've got this grouping in the lower right where there's a clear delineation that there's about 10 activities that are all interconnected. Then right next to it, there's a box that's closer to the left, but it's all by itself. So it's all by itself, so it must be a group of its own. And then the boxes that are on the left and on the upper right are all kind of interconnected each other. So that's where people generally tend to see 3 different groupings. Other people are making the association that there's 7 or more activities. And what they're seeing is those groups that are connected by only one line, they're not very tightly integrated with each other. They're only connected by one line. And they're mentally snipping that line and cutting it and saying, well, there's a group that's a lot more tightly close to each other in the upper right, but it's loosely coupled to the rest of them that it's connected to on the left. And so that's how you can end up with 7 or so groupings on it. And it's a pretty visual clue that's going to come in handy when we start getting into trying to clean up a diagram and creating sub-processes in dealing with event handling within BPMN is start with a diagram that looks convoluted, look for those areas that are tightly coupled with each other, and if they're loosely coupled to the rest of the diagram, it's very easy for you to cut some of it, create a single box, say it's a sub-process, and put the underlying detail on a different slide or a different tab within your diagram. And this slide here, this little exercise, I hope you guys will remember as you're diagramming and thinking about how you can make a diagram nice and clean and easy for people to see, but also drill down and see the underlying detail that's necessary to really understand where the opportunities to improve things are and the complexity of their own business processes. So again, just a couple of my favorite quotes here. I'm not going to read them. You guys can hopefully understand that detail can be important. For me, the big thing is using BPMN to accurately represent what the process is saying, to accurately represent the sequence, and making sure that whether you're at a high level or a low level of granularity, that the science behind the diagram accurately reflects what is happening in the business today. So again, I've got some slides here for those of you who struggle with questions about how far to go. There's no industry standard levels of definition. If you go out to Accenture or IBM, they'll say there are 3 levels or there are 4 levels. Some people say that there are 12 levels. I've broken it out for myself in terms of 7 levels. My 8th level is really not a process flow. It's really more, it's such detailed of you hit Control-Alt-Delete, and it's tied to what IT system or application you're using, and it's really more of a process or procedure or a training manual rather than a process model. Key thing about tasks, and again, when you go to a granular level, a task should always be completed by a single user. When you start talking systems integrations, it's even almost more fine-grained than what you do on a single screen. You know, if you have to search for a client and you're searching by name and you get a list of accounts back from them and then you want to update one account, that's the level of activity that you need to be thinking at for a system integration. The other key thing to think about when you're trying to define your task is looking at it from a service level agreement and customer experiences. So if you have a task that's supposed to be completed in 4 hours versus 2 minutes or 5 seconds, that can also kind of give you a feel for the level of detail that you need to go. Principles of process design, I think, also guide how far you need to go, what you're trying to improve. One, of whether work should be done, and 2, from Hammer and Hirschberger, how precisely work should be done. So from their book, I think they talk about some of the examples in the insurance industry. Progressive really made a name for themselves by taking data to a much finer grain level than their competition. And when they tell you who's less expensive from an insurance perspective, it's because they know exactly what type of risk you have, whereas other insurance companies may have grouped you into a category that you fit in, but it's at a bigger level. So how precisely you should do things and how precisely you want to measure things and where your niche is can also determine how precisely or detailed you need a process model. So some of the key lessons that I've learned personally from applying BPMN, again, words matter. I've learned that the hard way, and versus and then is probably one of the biggest factors that I learned. Before, I never bothered to specify what I was talking about, and it was no wonder that I caused confusion to others who read my model. Decisions are going to be related to business rules. So anytime you have an exclusive gateway, when you have one path or another path that you need to go down at the exclusion of the other, the path that you go down is either going to be based on an external event or it's going to be based on a business rule. And that's something, again, the BPMN notation taught me just by having a gateway being called an exclusive gateway. There's 2 types. There's either an event gateway or a data gateway. The concept of for each and how this type of loop impacts your process and your organizational change, I think, is really key. We'll talk about that in the second session in October. And then the importance of grouping tasks correctly into the sub-process. So that concept of snipping and cutting and how you drill down, again, there's both a science and an art behind it. And we'll talk a little bit about both of those again in the October session. All right, so getting into some of the details with BPMN, again, I think you may have seen this from Bruce Silver. This is a slide that I've used for quick reference of the most common BPMN elements, both from a business as well as an IT perspective. The notation itself, if any of you guys go out to the OMG website, you can print it out, and I think it's about 500 pages long. There's definitely additional symbols that are out there. I'll talk through some of them. But the key thing that I remember is the BPMN tasks on the left. It's either going to be a single task, it's going to be a multiple for each loop, or a do while loop, the third one down, or the one on the bottom, the sub-process. So that little box with a plus sign is very similar to like what you see in Microsoft Outlook or in your Internet Explorer or your browsers, to click and expand to see what subfolders you have under a higher level. So that plus sign is just indicating that there's underlying detail that's not represented on your model. That's a clue to users that it's not a single task, there's more underlying detail to it. BPMN events. I never thought about events before I was introduced to BPMN. Since I've been introduced to BPMN, I use them all the time, and I can guarantee you your IT department is. It's not so much from an event handling perspective as it is a way of, one, cleaning up your diagram and being able to accurately represent it when you do some of that snipping and cutting. It's also a really good mechanism to understand what to do when you send something out. How are you going to enforce the SLA? If you need to wait for your client to sign something, what are you going to do if they never send it back? Are you going to have your process hung up forever? Are you going to keep that order in flight? Are you going to eventually cancel it? Are you going to eventually call them? What are you going to do? And it's also helpful to understand some of the errors and exception paths that happen. The gateways, we'll talk through all of those. I've already talked through the concept of the and versus the exclusive. We also have an event gateway, and there's an inclusive gateway that we'll get through hopefully here today. There's a difference of splits versus merges. When you have, after a task, you have multiple activities that can happen, or if you need to have multiple activities to happen before you carry on. Larry, I did it again. Can you share my screen? Thank you. So again, within the BPMN notation, if you do download all 500 pages, there are 4 different types of diagrams. I'm really focusing on the business flow, I think what most of us are familiar with, and the choreography, we'll maybe talk a little bit about in October. The collaboration and conversation, I know that there's different shape set, and I'm not addressing that as part of this presentation. Some caveats around BPMN that I always like to talk about of, again, even though there is the science aspect of it, there are a lot of different symbols to use, and there are always different ways of modeling a single process. You can have 2 modelers. You could print out a paragraph and ask them to model it, and I guarantee 99% of the time you're going to get 2 different models, at least in context. They may be similar, they may be completely different. BPMN allows process models to be modeled in multiple ways. As long as we're following the technical aspects of it, the meaning should come across regardless. BPMN itself says when you are doing modeling to try to be consistent within your own models. Best practices that Bruce talks about will evolve over time as your organization becomes more process-oriented and more familiar with the models, so that you start to see consistency across different models. As part of my presentation, I purposely, you'll notice some of the diagrams look a little bit different than others. I've purposely used multiple tools so that you could see how the tools are similar and how they're different. The BPMN specification does specify, for example, that all activities within a process are a rectangle with a rounded box. All events are circles. All data objects will be square with a little triangle folded over in the upper right. This diagram here is just a representative to show you what all of the symbols are, and it doesn't look all that different than what you might see in what I'd call a Microsoft Visio or a PowerPoint type process flow. So we'll start with activities from a BPMN perspective. There are different activity types. In BPMN, a lot of the tools have these little pictures in the upper left Not all of the tools enforce it. Usually when you drag an activity onto a process model, it'll be blank and you won't see one of the symbols in the upper left. Some of the tools will force you to pick what type of activity is. The picture that's there represents whether it's a service or a system performed task. A mail little envelope represents it's either a receive or a send activity. So when you have an automated system that's going to automatically generate an email for you, that's a symbol that you may see. The head and shoulders indicates that it's a user activity, meaning that your user, the human, is doing work. They may be interfacing with a system to do the work, but it's a user activity versus a manual activity represented by the hands, meaning that there is no IT system that they're doing. If you're checking inventory as a user activity, chances are they're logging into a system to see what the system says is inventory, versus checking inventory as a manual task means I'm walking out to the warehouse floor and actually physically counting it. The business rule and the script symbols are used primarily when you've got a BPMS system in flight, whether a business rule engine is being called or the BPM system is automatically performing that task versus making a service call to another IT system. The activity markers within BPMN Larry, I lost the slides again. Q&A came up. Thank you. The activity markers are where you're going to represent whether or not a task is a single task or it's part of a loop. Most often, I see either single tasks or I see the multiple instance. The do while loop that's represented with a kind of like a circular arrow, I see very rarely. I've used very rarely. The multiple instance task is represented by 3 parallel lines. When they're vertical versus when they're sequence means whether the task can be, if they're up and down, that means that each of those instances can be performed in parallel to each other, versus when they're sideways or horizontal lines, it means that first one needs to be completed, then the next one, they need to be completed sequentially. Multiple instance is something I see all of the time. I think it's going to become clear when we start talking through some specific examples in October. Compensation is something that's in the notation. I have yet to see it in real life. It does exist. It is a fairly complex notation aspect that I'm not even going to be addressing in October. So we'll save that for the PhD lecture maybe next year. So again, the plus sign that is in an activity is used to indicate that there is a sub-process, meaning you either didn't get to the details or the details are underlying on another page, or you're able to drill down within your process model to see them. And a sub-process itself can be a do-while sub-process, a multiple instance sub-process, or a compensation sub-process. The ad hoc is the little tilde symbol. I see that in the process modeling from a business analyst perspective, and that's when it's the choice of whether I'm doing these activities in sequence or not is completely user dependent, and it is up to the user. We just know that they all need to be done before we go on to the next task. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get through gateways here in the next 15 minutes, but before I do, again, I don't know why I'm not always seeing the Q&A. I just want to do a quick sanity check and make sure that there have been no questions that have been posted thus far. Larry or Rod?
I don't see any. Laura, which have you clicked on the presenter view for the Q&A? There are 2 choices up there. One's a little...
Got it. Yeah, I don't see any, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything.
Yeah, I think you're
Okay,
good so far.
all right. So BPMN gateways, again, I think back to pre-BPMN, I was familiar with activities and I was familiar with putting a diamond on my diagram. The key thing within BPMN is gateways don't perform work. So when you do have a system that is a process that's automated, you have a workflow process that's in a BPM system, when you get to a gateway, there is no stopping. It is just a way to direct or route it, which means that before you get to the gateway, you have to have a task that helps determine which way you're going to pass when you get to the gateway. Gateways can be both merging as well as splitting from a scientific perspective. They can have multiple inputs or multiple outputs. Technically, the BPMN notation allows you to have both multiple inputs and multiple outputs. However, from a methodology perspective, I would strongly urge against that. It is very rare to accurately represent a process where you have multiple inputs and multiple outputs to the same type of gateway. So give me a few minutes and we'll see if we can get through that. BPMN events is an indication that something happens during a process. It can affect a process flow. It does not have to. It depends on the type of event that it is. They usually have a cause and or a reaction, but again, they don't have to. A lot of times an event is used to clearly mark from a business perspective that a milestone has been reached. Events can be placed in sequence flow. What you see on the top there, task 2, then the message, then going to task 3. That means the message is always going to happen. Events can also be placed on the boundary of an activity, what you see on the bottom, the boundary of task 1. In that case, when that happens, while task 1 is going on, if the message is received, task 1 will stop. It is going to interrupt task 1 from fully completing and redirect the flow to make task 3 occur. If task 1 completes successfully, we go on to task 2, and at the time of task 2, if the message comes in, the message is ignored. Okay, events being circles, from the scientific perspective, a single circle shows a start, a double circle is something that happens during the process, and a bold single circle indicates the end. It's pretty useful when you're in a diagram, again, especially when you have a more complex one, to quickly look for the circles to see where it starts, where it ends. Even for the intermediate ones, I've had director and executive level people take a look at a process diagram and say, wow, it's really easy for me to see how many errors and exceptions I have because the circles are pretty easy to spot against all the other squares and diamonds going on. The notification distinguishes between a colored in versus a outlined picture within the event. If it is a black icon, it represents a throwing or sending, which means the process is causing the event to occur, versus a white or outlined one where the process is going to wait to receive an event from somewhere else. So again, there's our most commonly used elements. So let's get into gateways. Again, they're not going to perform work. They direct the control of our sequence. They can have multiple inputs or multiple outputs. If you only have one input and one output, then you have the wrong shape. It's really not a gateway. So a split is used when you would have one input and multiple outputs. The gateway is going to direct how many of those outputs we're going to go down. An exclusive gateway can be represented as a blank diamond or with an X in the middle. And that means regardless of how many arrows you have coming out of the gateway, only one and only one path will be true, and only that path will be taken. An inclusive or a circle represented, it means one or more paths can be followed. So if you had 3 outputs, and an inclusive could say, well, for this particular piece of this particular order, I'm only following one path, but the next order that comes in, all 3 of the paths are going to be followed, and the order after that, only 2 of the paths are. An inclusive is actually a combination of the exclusive and the parallel below it in conjunction with each other. So the circle gateway is a way to help clean up your diagrams, and I'll get into that in the next couple of slides. The parallel and gateway means that all paths are taken. There is no question about it. No matter how many paths you have coming out, all of them will be followed. The notation itself has a complex gateway in it. I've not seen it in use, at least not in the IT side of things yet. I have seen different business analysts use a complex condition in their diagrams, mainly indicating that it's a really complex condition, and I really haven't dove into enough detail, and I'm not really sure how to represent it. If you're going to use a complex gateway, I highly recommend that you use a text annotation to clarify it, because it's not going to be clear to any of your readers how you know which path to follow. The event gateway is a diamond that has a circle. Again, the circles represent an event, and the pentagon inside of the circles represents any type of event can occur. The event gateway is similar to the exclusive gateway, meaning only one path can be taken, but the decision on which path to be taken is not based on the activity prior to it of evaluating a business rule, but it is based on which event is going to happen first. An event gateway is always going to have the next element in your sequence flow coming out of it is always going to be an event, and whichever event occurs is the path that will be followed. So let's take a look at that a little bit more here from an exclusive perspective. So two types of exclusive gateways, the data gateway. Okay, so here's an example that I have the activity of checking a credit score, then I have a gateway, and based on my credit score, I'm either going to be a low risk, a medium risk, or a high risk of a credit score, and based on which one of those categories I am is going to determine which path of whether or not my loan gets approved, whether I have to get collateral first before my loan's approved, or if I'm rejected. Okay, it's pretty clear. My credit score can only meet one of those criteria. I can't have both a high risk and a low risk credit rating. Okay? An event gateway, on the bottom, the example that I have is, first we're going to prepare a sales proposal. Then we're going to give the proposal to the customer and let them evaluate it. So when I send the proposal to the client, I now have to wait. I'm not going to place the order right away unless the client has accepted it. If the client rejects my proposal, I'm going to negotiate with the client and then hopefully wait for another response for the client to go ahead and place the order then. And what you see at the bottom is I've got an event timer there where if I don't hear back from the client within, let's say, 2 days or however long my service level agreement is, I want to make sure that I follow up with a customer. I don't want to just send proposals all day long and then wait for nothing to come back. If I'm a good salesperson, I'm going to follow up with them. So are there any questions on the concept of the exclusive gateways? All right, let's talk a little bit about the exclusive versus the inclusive. I think this is one of the harder concepts to grasp, but again, an inclusive I like to think of is instead of checking my credit score where I'm only looking at one particular data piece to make the decision, With an inclusive gateway, I'm actually looking at multiple data elements, and the example on the bottom there, if I'm going to review a customer's request for a proposal and prepare a quote, there may be a lot of attributes about that customer that determine what I need to do. So if the customer is from overseas or they're a foreign customer, I might need to notify the export or compliance group about this particular proposal and see if there are any export duties or something I need to be aware of in terms of telling the client about. If the customer is a particular size, if they're large or small, I might be able to give them a discounted price. Maybe if they're, you know, a lot of repeat business, I'll be able to give them a discounted price. So the example of the inclusive here, I could have modeled it very differently and said, the first thing I'll do is review the customer requirements. And after that activity, I could have had a parallel gateway going to individual tasks that says check to see if they're foreign, yes or no. Check to see if they're a large customer, yes or no. Check to see if it's a large order, yes or no. So the single gateway with the circle could have been replaced with first the parallel gateway, followed by 3 activities, followed by 3 exclusive gateways. My diagram gets very large, confusing looking, and kind of ugly. So it's a way to clean up your diagram. Some of the keywords to listen for are, for the exclusive gateway, is always it's either or. It's an if-then. There's no debate about it. An inclusive gateway is, you can also have the if-then, but it's used in conjunction with ands, also, sometimes, it depends. So when we talk about the exclusive gateway being a data gateway, again, the gateway is not doing work. So by the time you get to it, we need to know which way to go. That means that previous to it, there is some type of evaluation or refer to policy that is being done. A lot of times your business users aren't going to tell you about it. And when you're drawing a process model and you're using an exclusive gateway, I want you guys to remember this, because when you start getting into not only execution and trying to make your process be flexible, you want to understand what the rule is. How often does that rule change? Does it need to be exposed to the business to automatically update on their own? Do you need to use a rules engine? Who has authorization to change it? Is that rule being monitored by someone in management? Who knows that they need to review it and update it and make sure that it's not out of date? One of the, I think the key BPM candidates out there is UPS, and they talk about their 35-mile rule that somehow over the years got hard-coded into their systems, because back before there were cars, they charged a surcharge if they were delivering a package over 35 miles, because that's how far a horse could go before it needed stabled overnight. That's not something you really want to get hard-coded into your IT systems in today's day and age. So if you have to ask the question of do I charge the surcharge or not, yes or no, you want to know what that rule is based on. So going back to the example of checking my credit score, I don't recommend that you hard code in the actual numbers, 700, 600 to 699 or less than 600. The better approach is to keep it genericized, that there's a credit risk policy that is being reviewed to determine what your credit score is. That risk policy is going to define what is low, medium, or high. That credit risk policy is an input into your process. Because it's being used as an input into your process, remember the ins and outs that I talked about earlier, you want to make sure that there's something coming out of your process later, but you also want to make sure that someone's managing that input. That's a business rule and decision, and a lot of times the business forgets that they need someone who's going to review that. When the economy starts to tank, you know, maybe a low-risk client, instead of 700, it now has to be 750 or higher to be considered low risk. So that's something that you want to be thinking about. Okay, we are right at 3 o'clock. We just finished our gateway splits. I think when we pick it up in October, we'll talk about gateway merges. There are a lot of the same symbols, but there are a lot of nuances and differences when you have multiple inputs and a single output from your gateway. So with that, I think we'll end here. And Rod or Larry, again, if you guys want to open it up for any questions, I'm happy to stay online.
Okay, let's see. Everybody, thank you. um,
And again, for some reason, it clicked the icon, but I'm not seeing any questions. So if there are some, if you could read them to me, that'd be great.
Okay, I've got one here that says, related to leveling for process mapping, RBAs have struggled with when to map as a separate process versus a common process. And then it says, well, just I think my screen is jumping with new questions coming in. Okay, sorry. For example, maintain client account. The common repeatable activities might be to receive customer information, validate information, request missing information, update, system close. This could be mapped as the process, but some create maps for each type of customer information received. Is there a general rule that can be applied?
You know what? I think I figured it out. I see the question, so give me just a second.
Okay, sure.
Relating to the level of, I think there's a lot of questions around the level of detail. There is not a hard and fast rule. I wish there were. There is no general rule that can be applied. A process around maintaining an address or maintaining client information, that's a very narrow process in my mind. We get it all the time, but to me that almost gets more into data management. There are a lot of, I don't know how to politically correctly say this, but in most organizations, we're not in a strong or mature area of data governance. So when a client does request an address change and where it needs to get updated and through all of the systems and how it gets updated is usually a very manual and painful process, and a lot of systems don't always end up getting those updates made to it. So it may be something that is worthwhile to process model, but I'd almost argue that that's more of an internal IT or a data governance process to model, and the business knows that when a client changes their address, all of the systems should be updated. And it doesn't happen today because of our legacy systems and the system constraints that we have in place for it. That could take a while to process map and follow that through all the appropriate areas in an organization. I would doubt that updating an address itself, I mean, you're going to have that activity of update a client address in probably 20 different systems. The activity itself is repeatable of updating the address, but the tool or the system that you're updating it in, again, comes down to the what, why are you updating it in this system? I'm updating it for their performance report, I'm updating it for their billing, I'm updating it for, you know, whatever reasons. There is no hard and fast rule for it. The concept of common and repeatable activities, I'm hoping that we can touch on a little bit more in October when we start talking about sub-processes and the looping. So I may have to defer that one. And then Tammy, if that didn't answer your question, you want to reach out to me offline, I'd be happy to engage in a discussion with you. So there is a special task type for business rules. A business rule task would generally be before the gateway. That special symbol of using a business rule means that you actually have a business rule engine, and the evaluation of the rule is being performed as part of that system. I don't know if there's a question behind that. I'll be happy to try to keep the English words coming. Question from Tom, which BPMS tools are most compliant with BPMN 2.0 and which has most symbols incorporated? I would say pretty much all of them that are actually BPMS tools. Eris, Lombardi, Oracle, I think all of the big players are pretty compliant with BPMN 2.0, especially those that have a design environment. There is a difference of what the IT developers are using versus a lot of the environments that the business analysts would be using. It's very tool specific. Most of them support all of the symbols and the shapes. There's pros and cons and user friendliness associated with each of them. Again, I'd be happy to share any thoughts with you offline on that specifically. Gerard, about the real-time translation to process execution. I'm not going to talk about the executable environment. What I will say is, again, the benefit of using a BPMN notation is when you're modeling a process from a business perspective and you figure out the pain points and get to what the to-be is, if you give a developer the BPMN diagram, some of the tools allow import and export to suck it into a process execution. But once your process is executed, any changes that you make to it have to be made in that execution environment. You can't go back out into a BA type world, change the process, and then send it in. There's too much coding that really happens in the executable environment to make the import and export really work, and that's just generally what I've seen. So we'll talk a little bit more, we can talk a little bit more about how models are used to generate applications, again, in the second session. So the goal of the presentation here is to get you guys really familiar with how to use BPMN to model a process that could be understood both by business and IT. Why IT cares about it, again, if the purpose of your process is to be implementing a business process system that includes a rules engine, that includes workflow, that includes the BI and the process metrics, if you're talking about something like Oracle and Lombardi, the workflow itself is going to follow a very similar process. And you do want to have the process visible to the business users when it is in that executable environment. Most of them display to the users, here's where the workflow is for this particular order that you're processing. It's in step 26 of the process, and it's going to ship tomorrow. And sorry, I keep saying Lombardi. It's actually IBM. IBM bought Lombardi. They're one and the same now. So. I think I got through all of the questions. If there's any others, let me know. Otherwise, we'll chat again in October, and we'll keep going through with the BPMN notation.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And the PowerPoint actually will be up on the ABPMP website in a few days for if folks want to go pull it down and spend some of their time going through it.